You stand at the edge of a roaring river. The water is brutally cold. The current is incredibly fast. To cross the rushing water is to invite death. But your immediate survival entirely depends on reaching the distant other side. For hundreds of thousands of long years, this water was the ultimate physical boundary. Your ancient ancestors could not simply request a ferry boat or casually consult a digital map for a much safer route. The harsh natural landscape dictated exactly where human feet could safely tread. Then a fundamental and permanent shift occurred deep within the human brain. The completely impassable boundaries slowly transformed into a complex engineering challenge. How did your early ancestors conquer the massive gaps that nature deliberately placed in their path? You wake up exactly when your body is entirely ready. You have no mechanical alarm and you follow no artificial schedule. You are driven only by hunger and the shifting seasons. You track a herd of deer through the dense prehistoric forest. You move silently. You move with immense purpose. The tracks lead directly to the edge of a deep gorge. The deer have already bounded across a narrow section. You are left standing on the muddy bank. The gap is completely unjumpable. The fall would instantly shatter your bones. You sit on the damp earth and stare at the empty space between the cliffs. What is happening in your mind at this exact moment? You are experiencing a profound cognitive revolution. You are not just seeing an obstacle. You are actively imagining a physical solution that does not yet exist in the natural world. You look downstream and observe a massive fallen tree spanning a narrow creek. It is a completely natural and accidental occurrence. Gravity and fungal decay placed the heavy deadwood exactly there in that specific spot. The violent wind blew and the shallow roots finally gave way. The massive trunk shattered the surrounding green undergrowth as it fell heavily to the earth. Now it rests securely across the rushing white water. But your highly evolved primate mind suddenly perceives something entirely different. Your brain is uniquely wired to quickly recognize complex patterns and intentionally manipulate the physical environment around you. You do not just see a dead rotting tree. You see a viable tool. You see a primitive bridge. Have you ever considered that the very first bridge was not built but simply discovered? The earliest human bridges were exactly this: incredibly simple. They were naturally fallen logs or very carefully placed stepping stones in shallow, calm water. But restless human ambition rarely ever stops at the simple or the distinctly obvious. What exactly happens when the physical gap is simply far too wide for a single falling tree to span? You cannot grow a taller tree. You cannot instantly drain the deep river. You must fundamentally change your approach to the physical environment. You must begin to manipulate the heavy earth itself. You must gather massive stones from the surrounding landscape. You must place them in the water with absolute structural precision. In the harsh, windy moorlands of ancient prehistoric Britain, your resilient ancestors built the first clapper bridges. A clapper bridge is a rudimentary but highly effective structure. It is formed by carefully resting massive flat stone slabs across deliberately piled stone piers. The famous tar steps located in modern Exmoor National Park stand today as a lasting monument to this raw physical human effort. You walk along the riverbank and carefully locate massive flat slabs of dense stone. Some of these incredibly heavy slabs weigh up to 2 entire tons. You absolutely cannot lift them alone. You must organize your extended tribe. You must utilize basic wooden leverage and immense collective human muscle to slowly drag these giant monoliths into the freezing running water. You stack them carefully without any form of modern mortar or chemical cement. You rely entirely on the downward force of gravity to hold them securely against the rushing seasonal current. How many frustrating times did the angry river wash away the heavy stones before your determined ancestors finally learned the perfect structural placement? The moving water is entirely relentless. It constantly seeks to erode and destroy anything sitting in its natural path. You quickly learn to align the vertical supporting stones perfectly parallel to the rushing current. You intentionally create minimal physical resistance against the powerful flow of the river. You are actively learning complex fluid dynamics entirely through brutal trial and error. You are learning fundamental physics through sheer human willpower and survival instinct. But stones are incredibly heavy. Rivers are dangerously wide. A massive flat slab of rock will eventually crack and catastrophically fail under its own immense weight if the gap between the supports is too large. Gravity will constantly pull the unsupported center of the stone downward until it violently snaps in half. You cannot simply build longer flat stone bridges. You must fundamentally change the internal shape of your physical construction. You must finally discover the power of the arch. When did the human mind first truly grasp the abstract concept of transferring physical weight indirectly into the solid earth? Travel forward in time to the dry, rocky Peloponnese region of ancient Greece. The surrounding environment is incredibly rugged. The summer air is hot and distinctly dry. The year is roughly 1300 before the Common Era. You are standing in the dust before the mighty Archaeology Bridge. It is currently one of the oldest arched stone bridges still in existence anywhere in the entire world. You are a Mycenaean builder. You do not have modern liquid cement. You do not have rigid steel rebar to reinforce your structures. You only have raw jagged limestone boulders harvested from the nearby hills. You must use a very specific ancient technique called Cyclopean masonry. This is a unique type of monumental stonework built with massive heavy limestone boulders. They are roughly fitted together with very minimal physical clearance between the adjacent heavy stones. Why is it called Cyclopean? Later classical Greek civilizations looked at these massive ancient structures in pure awe. They firmly believed that only the mythical one-eyed giants known as the Cyclopes could have possibly possessed the sheer physical strength required to move such massive heavy rocks. You roughly shape the jagged boulders with crude heavy tools. You stack them highly intentionally. You carefully overlap each heavy stone layer slightly inward over the supportive layer directly below it. You are slowly creating a corbel arch. The two sides inch closer together as they rise higher into the hot air. Finally, they meet perfectly in the exact center. How does a massive heavy structure built entirely without modern binding agents miraculously survive millennia of violent earthquakes and constant physical use? The ultimate engineering secret is pure compression. You are deliberately turning the dead downward weight of the heavy stone completely against itself. You place a final heavy keystone at the very top of the curved arch. This specific stone physically forces the downward pressure to immediately radiate outward instead of straight down. The immense physical force is driven deeply and securely into the solid stable ground on either side of the wide gap. Your human body understands this physical concept entirely intuitively. You distinctly feel this exact same physical principle when you press your two hands together forcefully in front of your own chest. The harder you push, the more stable your hands become. The massive heavy stones of Archaeology are forever locked in a permanent structural embrace. This specific ancient bridge was not built simply for local pedestrians to casually cross the small ravine safely. It was explicitly designed and structurally engineered to fully accommodate the incredibly heavy wooden wheels of fast military war chariots. You are actively building advanced military and economic infrastructure. The esteemed modern archaeologist Richard Hope Simpson has extensively and meticulously mapped these ancient Mycenaean road networks. He systematically proved through physical evidence that they were highly organized logistical systems. They were specifically designed to quickly project overwhelming military force and tighten absolute economic control across the highly rugged and difficult landscape. Are monumental bridges ultimately about fostering peaceful human connection, or are they essentially complex tools designed for exerting absolute political dominance over a physical territory? You build smooth paved roads to move your heavy armies rapidly. You build massive stone bridges to collect your imperial taxes efficiently. The stone arch directly allows you to safely carry massive logistical loads over incredibly deep natural ravines. But the heavy stone arch strictly requires a very solid geological foundation. It absolutely requires heavy, immovable physical materials. What exactly do you do when the surrounding natural environment offers absolutely no such luxury? Move your mind completely across the globe. Travel far away to the incredibly high freezing altitudes of the Andes Mountains in South America. The mountain air is dangerously thin and incredibly cold. The rocky canyons are impossibly deep and entirely terrifying. The narrow rivers far below are violent churning torrents of freezing glacial meltwater. You absolutely cannot build a heavy compression stone arch here. The steep ground is far too geologically unstable. The physical gap between the sheer rocky cliffs is simply far too wide. The heavy stones would immediately collapse into the dark void. You must urgently look for a completely different building material entirely. You look down directly at the cold ground beneath your bare calloused feet. You see a simple, unremarkable tuft of native ichu grass growing in the freezing wind. It is an incredibly tough and highly fibrous mountain plant. It naturally grows abundantly along the harsh, unforgiving mountain slopes. A single solitary blade of this grass is completely weak and entirely useless. You can snap it easily between your two fingers with absolutely no physical effort. It cannot hold any weight. But you do not ever use a single solitary blade. You take a massive handful. You twist several thin blades tightly together in your hands. You create a thin continuous woven cord. You then take several of those thin woven cords. You twist those thin cords together tightly. You create a much thicker and highly sturdy rope. You then gather several of those thick sturdy ropes. You twist those massive ropes together. You ultimately create a massive heavily braided cable that is entirely as thick as a grown adult human torso. The ancient expanding Inca Empire completely mastered this incredible physical transformation. They turned the weakest natural materials into immense structural and political power. They successfully created a vast, highly intricate network of incredibly long suspension bridges. These woven bridges spanned absolutely deadly mountain canyons and effectively connected a massive expanding empire. Have you ever actually trusted your entire physical life to a simple piece of braided dead grass swaying wildly hundreds of feet above a deadly drop? At the remote village of Queshuachaca in modern-day Peru, this incredible ancient engineering practice is still vividly and actively alive today. The local indigenous farming communities gather together to completely rebuild the massive grass bridge entirely by hand. They do this highly intensive communal labor every single year without any fail. The entire rebuilding process is a stunning masterpiece of highly coordinated collective human effort. It is an absolute triumph of applied physical tension. The prominent modern anthropologist Dr. Heather Lechtman has extensively and thoroughly studied ancient Inca metallurgy and their unique prehistoric engineering techniques. She deeply noted a highly distinct and profoundly important cultural difference in their fundamental prehistoric problem-solving methods. While the traditional European builders heavily favored the rigid static compression of heavy dead stone, the ancient Andean builders heavily favored the flexible dynamic tension of woven organic fibers. You weave the massive main bridge cables safely on the solid flat ground. You and your community carry the incredibly massive heavy grass coils to the terrifying edge of the deep rocky abyss. You secure these massive woven ropes to enormous heavy stone abutments that are carved deeply and permanently into the solid cliffs on either exact side of the terrifying gorge. Why would you ever deliberately choose to build with a weak organic material that naturally rots and must absolutely be completely replaced annually when you could at least try to build something entirely permanent out of stone? The specific natural environment itself dictates the absolute optimal engineering solution. Violent massive earthquakes regularly and completely destroy rigid heavy stone structures in this highly active and dangerous seismic zone. A rigid inflexible stone wall will violently crack and immediately shatter into pieces when the unstable ground shakes. A highly flexible woven rope bridge simply sways smoothly and safely with the violently trembling earth. It literally dances gracefully with the massive geological destruction. When the violent, terrifying tremors finally stop completely, the woven grass bridge simply settles naturally back into its original safe resting place. It is a profoundly different and highly adaptive engineering philosophy. You fully embrace the inherent extreme volatility of nature rather than foolishly trying to rigidly and statically resist it. You completely accept that absolutely nothing is permanently guaranteed. You fully accept that constant regular communal maintenance is simply a mandatory part of daily human survival in a harsh environment. You sit on the edge of the cliff and carefully weave the flexible floor of the bridge from slightly smaller woven ropes. You carefully weave the necessary side handrails to provide vital safety from the terrifying dropping wind. You finally step out slowly over the absolutely terrifying and deadly empty void. The wind howls aggressively around your body. You are physically supported entirely by the mathematical tension of woven dead grass and the intensive collective physical labor of your entire local community. The bridge safely holds your entire weight. You cross the deadly mountain gap entirely safely. But there is actually an even more profoundly amazing way to successfully work with volatile nature to safely cross a deep physical chasm. What if you strictly do not use any dead materials at all in your construction? Travel incredibly far away to the dense, dark, and incredibly wet, lush forests of Meghalaya. This is a highly mountainous remote region located heavily in northeastern India. The massive annual monsoon rainfall here is not measured in small millimeters. It is consistently measured in massive deep meters. It is highly officially consistently ranked as one of the absolute wettest geographical places on the entire planet Earth. The heavy constant rain is entirely deafening. Placid shallow rivers violently swell into massive raging highly destructive torrents entirely overnight. The insanely rushing dark water quickly and violently washes away any dead wood. The incredibly constant heavy air humidity completely rots woven grass rope in a matter of a few short weeks. The highly pervasive airborne moisture rapidly rusts completely exposed iron metal into totally useless soft orange flakes. You absolutely cannot physically build a bridge here in any standard traditional structural sense. The highly aggressive wet jungle will rapidly and completely consume it. The violently flooded river will easily and completely destroy it. How do you possibly build a structurally lasting physical architecture in a harsh place that actively digests and destroys human engineering? You absolutely do not build the bridge. You slowly grow it. The indigenous Khasi and Jaintia tribal people closely and patiently observed the highly unique local jungle flora. They slowly realized through deep observation that the specific plant known as Ficus elastica produces incredibly thick and highly strong secondary aerial roots. This plant is a very specific massive species of the native Indian rubber tree. These thick secondary roots actually grow straight horizontally outward from very high up on the massive main wooden trunk. They do not grow underground. They grow directly in the highly humid air. They are constantly organically seeking ambient moisture and physical structural stability in the damp heavy jungle air. You systematically find a highly suitable young rubber tree naturally growing very near the steep muddy riverbank. You deliberately take a completely hollowed out dead beetle nut tree trunk. You carefully lay this highly specific hollow wooden tube directly across the raging river. You firmly secure it tightly to the muddy opposite bank. You then carefully and very gently guide the highly tender young flexible growing roots of the massive rubber tree directly straight through this long hollow wooden tube. You are actively and intentionally directing the completely natural biological growth of the living plant entirely across the deadly rushing water. It is an incredibly slow, completely silent, and intensely biologically patient process. It is the absolute opposite of fast modern industrial construction. It routinely takes an entire full decade just for the slowly creeping roots to finally physically reach the completely opposite side of the rushing river. Can you possibly imagine intentionally planning a highly vital piece of physical infrastructure that you yourself might absolutely not live long enough to ever see fully completed? You carefully teach your young children exactly how to tend the slowly growing roots properly. You systematically teach them exactly how to carefully weave the newly growing thin green tendrils directly into the existing thickening structural organic matrix. When the massive main leading roots finally successfully reach the completely opposite muddy river bank, they eagerly and rapidly take deep physical hold in the dark, rich, wet soil. They quickly thicken immensely. They naturally harden physically until they are almost exactly like solid iron. Professor Ferdinand Ludwig is a highly pioneering modern scientific researcher who extensively studies this exact phenomenon known as living architecture. He carefully notes in his detailed academic studies that these unique structural botanical bridges actually become vastly and exponentially physically stronger over incredibly long periods of time. The closely woven individual tree roots literally physically fuse completely together. They successfully combine their entirely separate physical structures through a highly specific natural biological process known scientifically as inosculation. Inosculation is exactly when separate living plant parts physically grow entirely together to permanently share internal vital sap and absolute structural physical integrity. The completely separate fragile thin root strands successfully become one single massive unified structurally sound living biological organism permanently spanning the rushing river. You carefully weave small flat local rocks and heavily packed damp dirt directly into the naturally forming wooden root gaps. You deliberately create a highly smooth, entirely safe flat walking surface for the local villagers to use daily. The massive living root bridge continues to organically grow naturally larger and physically thicker every single day. It actively continues to biologically heal its own minor structural wounds instantly when physically damaged by the falling branches or violent floods. The progressively older the living bridge gets, the significantly safer it continuously becomes to actively cross. This specific incredible realization is the ultimate entirely counterintuitive historical turning point in the entire long history of advanced human structural engineering. Modern highly industrial global society exclusively builds massive structural infrastructure to be entirely physically static. You currently rely completely and entirely on completely dead, highly refined industrial materials. You exclusively use factory-manufactured heavy steel and chemically poured concrete. These common modern building materials are incredibly physically strong initially upon construction, but they are completely and utterly biologically dead. They actively begin chemically decaying and physically breaking down the very exact precise moment they are permanently exposed to the natural outdoor elements. They mandate constant, incredibly expensive, completely artificial physical maintenance just to ultimately prevent catastrophic structural failure and total deadly collapse. Your distant, highly observant ancestors living deep in the wet forests of Meghalaya actively did the exact, complete, fundamental opposite. They successfully utilized a completely living, breathing, dynamic biological organism to permanently solve a highly complex structural civil engineering problem. A properly tended living root bridge can easily functionally last for many long centuries. It continually and biologically actively repairs itself entirely without any modern industrial tools. It organically grows naturally thicker and immensely more structurally resilient with every single violently passing wet monsoon season. It mandatorily requires intense, highly patient intergenerational foresight. It mandatorily requires profound forward-looking environmental community planning. It mandatorily requires a deeply, intimately acquired, thorough understanding of incredibly slow, entirely natural biological growth processes. Why exactly do entirely modern humans universally strictly prioritize the absolute sheer speed of rapid artificial construction completely over permanent structural longevity and a truly lasting functional harmony with the surrounding natural environment? You currently live daily in a highly modern structured world of completely instant, entirely effortless physical connections. You rapidly cross massive, heavily engineered steel suspension bridges during your daily fast commute completely without a single passing second thought regarding the complex physics actively keeping you alive. You listen casually to highly compressed digital music inside a completely artificially climate-controlled, fast-moving metal vehicle. You entirely casually traverse incredibly deep, massive bodies of dark rushing water that would have absolutely, utterly terrified your primitive prehistoric ancient ancestors to their very core. But those incredibly impressive modern structural engineering marvels are ultimately merely a highly polished modern extension of the exact same initial cognitive evolutionary leap that successfully happened hundreds of thousands of long years ago in the dense prehistoric forest. The highly desperate, entirely human survival desire to successfully permanently conquer the physical geographical gap absolutely remains entirely unchanged within your modern brain. The deep underlying universal physical mathematical rules of structural tension, downward compression, and sliding friction have absolutely not altered naturally in the slightest minute degree. Every single mundane time you safely cross a structurally sound bridge, you are actively, unknowingly, fully participating deeply in one of the absolute oldest, most highly vital, entirely unbroken long traditions of pure human problem-solving ingenuity. You are implicitly trusting the incredibly ancient, completely primal fundamental realization that the unforgiving physical natural world can absolutely be intentionally manipulated and structurally engineered to successfully serve highly specific human survival needs. The violently roaring, cold, rushing river actively existing at the very dangerous edge of your physical existence can absolutely always be safely, permanently crossed. You wake up exactly precisely when your physical body is entirely internally ready. You have absolutely no loud mechanical alarm, and you have absolutely no artificial imposed schedule. But the rushing cold river is absolutely definitely still right there waiting for you. You stand completely still at the dangerous edge of a rapidly rushing mountain stream. The cold dark water is incredibly fast and incredibly swift. But deeply inside your evolved mind, you now know absolutely exactly how to successfully rapidly reach the distant other side.